everyone joining today, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Dr. Lara Gharibeh, a research fellow here at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. I'm your host for today's episode of BEaTS Research Radio, a YouTube channel and podcast produced by the Bioengineering and Therapeutic Solutions Lab at the Ottawa Heart Institute. Our goal at BEaTS Research Radio is to communicate science to the community. Our guest today is Dr. Ali Abdul-Sater. Dr. Abdul-Sater completed his PhD in immunology at the University of California in the States. He then moved to pursue his postdoctoral studies at Columbia University. In 2013, he moved to Canada and joined the Department of Immunology at the University of Toronto as a postdoctoral fellow in the laboratory of Dr. Tanya Watts. Dr. Abdul-Sater was then appointed as an assistant professor in 2016 and established his research group at York University in Toronto. His research is focused on identifying novel regulators of inflammation and understanding the molecular mechanisms through which these regulators control the inflammatory response. Dr. Abdul-Sater has been granted multiple awards recently, including the York Research Chair in 2020, STARS Career Development Award from the Arthritis Society in 2019, and the Banting Research Foundation Discovery Award in 2018. We at BEaTS Research Radio are delighted to host Dr. Abdul-Sater today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you. We like to always start by asking our guest about his career journey that contributed to setting him onto the path where he is today. Can you tell us a bit more about your journey?
Absolutely. So I started my research career back in Lebanon, where I'm from and grew up, and really joined the American University of Beirut, started my master's in biochemistry, and we were looking at how statins, those anti-cholesterol drugs, if you want to call them that way, regulate cyclooxygenases, and then so that really set me on the path of research interest. And as you know, given if you want to progress far in this field, you need to get training in other parts of the world, as they say. So that's what I left, and I came to the States to do my PhD in California, and University of California. That's where I started really transitioning into studying immune responses, specifically the innate immune responses, those early reactions we have towards pathogens and injury. And we were looking at chlamydia infections and how that interfaces with the host response, with the immune response. And then I moved to New York City, Columbia University. That's when I started my postdoctoral studies, and that's when I really started transitioning into studying inflammation, which is a component of that innate immune response, as I mentioned. It's one of those really protective things that we need to combat infections and heal from injury and infections. And as part of that, those antiviral responses, very common nowadays with the COVID situation, as in one of the most important things that are important for clearing the infection. But what my interest was really not specifically at how inflammation is important to protect us from injury. My interest started becoming in how do we keep inflammation in control, as in when inflammation is too, when you have an overactive inflammatory response, or when inflammation is not shut down, it's supposed to shut down, then you have actually a detrimental effect, a disease, right? Lots of the diseases we now in the world are rooted in that what we like to call aberrant inflammation or improper inflammation, including most people who actually die from COVID now is because the inflammatory response was too strong, right? And then you have the autoimmune diseases and cardiovascular disease, and which is an interest, obviously, of your listeners. A lot of it is rooted in bad inflammation, if you want to call it that way. So that's when my interest in that lab at Columbia, this is when I started really thinking about those things. So I moved to Canada, to Toronto, University of Toronto, to do a second postdoctoral study. And that's when I had, the lab doesn't really deal in inflammation, but that's what I wanted to do. And I, started thinking about how a protein that lab was interested in called TRAF1, how that regulates inflammation. And that's what I did. And then in 2016, I started my own lab as an assistant professor at York University. And that's the kind of research I do, is really looking at how we control inflammation. How is that important to potentially develop therapies for, autoimmune diseases and other diseases that are rooted in inflammation.
That's very interesting. I will move to my second question. As you mentioned, one of your research interests involves rheumatoid arthritis disease.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about it, and how is your research contributing to further advance its treatment?
Right. So as I mentioned throughout my kind of intro, when I was at University of Toronto, we were interested in a protein called TRAF1, which is a protein that is found inside the cells that allows our immune cells to relay a signal once they see a pathogen, if you want. This is how they relay the signal inside the cell to act on that pathogen. So that's been known, but what wasn't known is that this protein turns out to act, if you want, as a brake on inflammation, which is what we discovered when I was at U of T. So if you have less of that protein, your inflammatory cells, the ones that make that inflammation, make those proteins, the cytokines in response to inflammation, they go nuts and they start making too much inflammation, right? So if you have less of that protein. And turns out that people who have a higher risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis throughout their life have less of that protein, and that's what we found. So if people with a high risk of RA, what we call it RA, rheumatoid arthritis, they have less of that protein, and their inflammatory cells cannot control inflammation like it should. So they produce too much inflammation every time they're exposed to an infection or injury, and over time that causes them to develop RA. So in my lab now, we are interested of how can we harness this knowledge to develop a therapy targeting this protein in RA. And that's what we're trying to do now. Of course, it turns out it's very complicated. You cannot just go put too much of the protein back. Because as I said, if it's low level, then you have too much inflammation. Turns out if you put too much of it, then other immune cells get overactive, and that's also bad. So you can't have too much, you can't have too little, right? So what we're doing is finding a way to actually target unique functions of this protein. It's like a Swiss Army knife, does multiple things, but we want to target the arm that really controls inflammation and keeps the brake on inflammation, and that's what we're doing. So we're doing, it's a lot of at the basic research level at this point. We're not really clinical, but with a very clear applicable, with a clinical approach in the future. So we're doing now at the cellular level, and we have mouse models to test our mechanism of actually targeting this protein using genetic tools. So that's where we are now, and we're hope to move on to the start developing drugs and clinical strategy. Probably next 5 years or so.
That's every researcher's ultimate goal, finding the new drug to treat the disease.
Right.
You are an early career faculty investigator, and having established your group a couple of years before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, can you share with us a bit your experience in dealing with the difficulties of this year?
Right, absolutely. I think, like most people, we were shut down early. When in March 20. Even forgot what year was that. Was that 2020? It just seems like time has stopped. Yeah. So in March 2020, we were shut down when the whole province shut down, and most of the world actually shut down. And so we had on a very short notice closed experiments, shut down our mouse facility, everything, and that was tough, right? So we were shut down for 4 months, and that set us back many months. And during that time, we started thinking of, okay, maybe we can use this time to write, to read, that kind of stuff. And now we were doing that. And now, luckily we were able to resume with a limited capacity, as most people, with a very tight, kind of like schedule. And some people can come in the morning, some people can come in later, and with reduced capacity. But, luckily for us, we had the space, and the university was very understanding as the importance of moving forward with this research. So we developed strategies that allow us to resume, and we kind of came back full time. And in the meantime, we also decided, hey, what about, given the now the interest in COVID, and as I mentioned to you in my also introduction, that one of the reasons why many COVID patients end up dying or having significant disease is because of runaway inflammation. Too much of that interferon responses they have becomes overzealous, if you want, and then that leads to that lung inflammation, and essentially patient cannot breathe anymore, and they end up needing a ventilator and sometimes dying. So given our interest in inflammation, and specifically interferons, one of the things I didn't mention it in when we talked about arthritis. Obviously, it's got nothing to do with arthritis, but one of the things we're interested in is type 1 interferon responses and how are they regulated? Because again, I like to understand how inflammation is regulated, and interferons is part of that. So we started studying type 1 interferons in we don't do now COVID research, if you want, because of the biosafety levels involved in this research, but we study other pathogens that are viral pathogen that are kind of you can learn a lot about the immune response and the role of interferons in them. So we transitioned to starting doing this kind of research, and that also opened the possibility of collaborating with other researchers in Toronto at UHN, and that allow us to do this kind of research. So that was, if you want, one of the good things that came out of the that pandemic.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I mean, you try to do what you can, and without really losing focus. Though I see a lot of, you might have noticed this, a lot of researchers kind of like that, they dropped everything they're doing, started transitioning into studying COVID, which is fine. That's good. That's how we were able to learn a lot about this disease. And that's, but some people have no business in doing that. So so we didn't lose focus on our goal, like studying inflammation, but you can adapt it to learn more about a particular emerging pathogen, and that's what we're doing. Yeah,
that's very nice. You just mentioned that with the whole pandemic situation happening, research was cut down. There are people that were coming on different schedules. How do you see research and academia in general progressing as we move out of the pandemic status with the expansion of vaccination? Do you see new ways of working and learning? And do you see yourself going into new research avenues to pursue in the future?
Absolutely. Now, obviously, the work that has to be done in the lab still has to be done in the lab. That's not going to change. But what I think will change, give you an example. So we used to, if I wanted to have a meeting with a collaborator who is in Toronto or in a different even city, before the pandemic, we would not think of a possibility of how we want to talk. You have to see each other, right? So you have to go meet somewhere. The idea of just what we're doing now over Zoom, and it kind of had the same effect, was not even think about it properly, right? So or we never thought it would work. So that's one way. I think it brings collaborations easier, brings people together more. So that's one thing that would definitely change. I think a lot of that interaction could happen remotely. Not that would obviously completely replace in-person communication, which will continue to happen, and that's great. But same thing for meetings with students and trainees in the lab. That used to have to happen in person, and I still think it's important. But now we have faster ways, better ways. So that's definitely a lot of that I think will remain in place going forward. As in that potentially a lot of the science really happen in collaboration and discussions and at conferences and whatnot. I still think so we're probably going to go back to in-person conferences, which is very important. I'm doing a lot of those. There's the AAI now, which is the biggest immunology conference in the world, happening now today as well. Not been the same. I mean, being at home, using it, you're not in the mode where you're actually at a conference and that's all your focus. It's different. So I'm sure it's going to go back, but with the potential of opening it up online for people who cannot come in, right, or don't have the means or are too far. So that's great. I think it will encourage, especially people with from under-resourced, let's call them, countries or universities or institutions. That's going to allow them more accessibility, which is amazing, because that will bring brain power and people who could not have been there, right, and potentially bring them in and involve them in the whole scientific process. So I think it's going to advance sciences for sure. I don't think so that's one way I'm thinking about it. But, yeah.
And are you thinking about pursuing new research avenues?
Right. Yeah. So that's one of the things I mentioned. We're definitely going to continue focus. As we start learning more about the role of interferons, as I mentioned to you, and in those viral infections, we are very interested in adapting our results and our models to the SARS-CoV-2, the virus causes COVID, and with emerging mouse models, because all what we do are in mice now. Mouse models that are adapted to that virus doesn't infect mice naturally, but now there are models where what it does. So we're that's one thing we're definitely going to take it forward, as in start learning how interferons specifically. As we really are interested in the different subtypes of type 1 interferon. There are about 16 of them. And we're interested on what each one does in this disease. So that's the kind of I think model we'll be doing.
But I'll be for sure looking forward to seeing the results of these studies.
Yeah.
To conclude our interview today, my last question for you is: what are words of advice that you would like to provide specifically to early career professionals or even young people who are interested in pursuing a career in science and research?
Right. So I think I would say that I would say the same thing I would tell my students when I'm interviewing them. They want to join the lab at the stage. They could be undergrads that want to do undergrad research, or master's student, or PhD, or even postdoc. So when we discuss, I tell them, I think research is. Sorry if you're hearing something in the background now. For the listeners, that's my that's my son in JK. He's off of the off of class now, so he's singing. Right. So going back to the question, so I would say academia specifically and research is an amazing experience and very rewarding, and but you really have to have the love of discovery, and you want to be doing this because you want to do this, because that's something of interest to you. You want to learn how to discover, and you want to continue to ask these questions and find answers and contribute to potential therapies and all that kind of stuff. But don't do it if that's the only, there's nothing else available and I'm doing it. It's, that's what I advise them to do. I think it's amazing, and it's, we need people to continue to be interested in this, but they have to be doing it just because of it. And it's not the easiest of journeys, to be honest. I don't lie to people and tell them, oh yeah, this is great, it's easy, just get into it and then you'll be fine, right? It's not easy. It takes a lot of perseverance, and that's what you need to have. You have to be able to learn how to accept failure. You're going to fail in your experiments, and in grant writings and in manuscript submissions. You just have to learn how to deal with it and not stop. So if you're, and that's where if you're built for this, right? Not everyone is, but a lot of people are, and that's how you can test yourself, right? So it's not an easy journey, but I think the rewards are really great at the end. So that's my advice: is only get into it if it's something you're really passionate about and interested in.
Exactly. Well, this concludes our interview. Once again, I'd like to thank our guest today, Dr. Ali Abdul-Sater, for the informative and fascinating talk with us regarding his role and journey in academia. It was a pleasure having you, Dr. Abdul-Sater.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate this opportunity and talking to you today.
On behalf of our director, Emilio Alarcon, and the whole BEaTS Research Radio team, thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube, BEaTS Research Radio, and podcast channels, and we'll see you again with another Science for the Community episode. Until then, stay safe.